The Jam may have been out of fashion with the critics, but they couldn't have been that unpopular with the public, because they were announced as the headlining act for the first night of the annual Hippie Hard Rock Reading Festival at the end of August 1978. And given that the New Hearts and a great band from Newcastle called Penetration were also on the bill, suggesting a determination by the promoters to draw in some of us new wavers, I planned on ending my summer holiday there. And I figured on starting it in equally music fan fashion at the Institute of Contemporary Arts on Pall Mall, next to Buckingham Palace, for an exhibition launched by Who fans entitled Who's Who. I had a sneaking suspicion that members of the Who themselves might show up for the opening day. They were just the kind of rock stars that would do such a thing. I was right. I went with Christopher and Adrian, both now firm Who fans, thanks largely to my encouragement. And when we got there, we found ourselves immediately drawn to a crowd surrounding Pete Townshend himself being interviewed for radio. The Who had a new LP coming out soon, Who Are You? And it included songs like Music Must Change that reflected Townshend's support for the new wave. All the press I'd read suggested that he wanted to retire the Who but couldn't bring himself to do so. Nothing changes then. A compromise had apparently been reached. The Who would not be touring to support the new album. I was just glad I'd seen them at Charlton in '76, before it was too late. We hung around at the back of the crowd, more or less the youngest kids in the ICA. And it was probably for that very reason that, when they finished interviewing Pete Townshend, the hosts from Capital Radio's Sunday magazine show Hullabaloo turned towards us, thrust their microphones in our faces, and asked us what we were doing there. What possible appeal could the Who have for the younger generation? Christopher went first. They smashed up their instruments, he said, and that was brilliant. I went next. I said that they were from the 60s, but their music was still relevant today, and that was brilliant too. The DJs told us to listen out on Sunday, that they probably use us. And with the confidence that came from being potential radio celebrities, we set off about the ICA with a spring in our step. The exhibition included all the Who's single sleeves, except for the now mythically rare Ready Steady Who, Roger Daltrey's jacket from Woodstock or something equally unimportant, a stage set up with their equipment, a film of the group in their early days smashing up their equipment, and one of Townshend's broken Rickenbackers nailed to the wall in pieces, with a frame around it like the work of art that it truly was. And upstairs, there was a hologram of Keith Moon on the drums. Holograms were the new thing. Three-dimensional projections, just like how Princess Leia looked when beamed onto other planets for an intergalactic phone call in the Star Wars films we'd all gone to see the previous summer. The Who, already famous for their use of lasers, were apparently among the pioneers of the form, and it had to be said, it was an impressively lifelike optical illusion. I got to see just how lifelike when I felt someone sidle up next to me and turned around to find myself looking at Moon himself. I knew that Keith was in the building. The buzz had been going around the ICA all morning. And I had hoped I might find him at some point and get his autograph, even if it meant he's pouring a bottle of brandy over me or doing something similar in keeping with his reputation for lunacy. But I had never anticipated that I would find myself standing next to him, with no bodyguards, no radio or TV interviews, nobody at all except around us other than a kid much my own age who seemed to be in his company. And that kid, by the way, was Zach Starkey. I was nervous, but I wasn't going to waste the opportunity. I turned to him, he was only about my height, and made a shy comment about how weird this must feel for himself, looking at a three-dimensional image of himself. He agreed, quietly, calmly, nothing like his image. Emboldened, though still dead nervous, I dropped my hand into my sports bag and removed the issue of Jamming I'd brought with me, the one in which I'd written up the 2-page history of The Who, and asked him ever so politely if he would mind signing it for me. Keith looked at the magazine, checked the cover, had a quick look at the story, 2 pages of regular type, no photos, and said, "I don't think I've seen this one." "You wouldn't have," I said to myself, given that we'd only printed 150 copies. And apart from those I got placed in the local newsagent and, impressively, the Virgin store at Marble Arch, most had been sold at school. "It's my own magazine," I said out loud instead. "I'd like to read this article sometime," said Keith. He totally kind of perfected the posh accent. That's part of Keith's personality. "You can keep it if you want," I replied. And I meant it. Of course he could. "No, you want it autographed," said the drummer. And he signed his name across the top corner of the page with a flourish. "Tell you what, though," he continued, and he produced a slip of paper from an inside pocket and scribbled down an address. "Here's where I live," he said as he handed it to me. "Come and see me. Bring a copy of your magazine. Any time's fine by me." And then he moved along. As he departed, I studied the scrap of paper. The address said Curzon Place, W1. When I got home, I found out it was in Mayfair, the most expensive piece of property in Monopoly. A few days later, I was back on the number 3 bus into central London. I had in my bag all the issues of Jamming and a couple of Who records to get signed, and in my stomach, I carried enough butterflies to launch an exhibit of my own. I knew Soho well enough now, but I'd never had any reason to venture the other side of Regent Street. All I knew about Mayfair was what my mother told me, that it was full of wealthy Arabs, and apparently the wealthy prostitutes who serviced them. Curzon Place was tucked in just behind Park Lane, the second most expensive property in Monopoly. I expected to find a security guard blocking my way at number 9, but there was no one there. The whole building was eerily quiet. I felt a little like an intruder. I knew I didn't belong, but then I reminded myself I had been invited. I had permission. I took the lift upstairs and then walked down the carpeted corridor to flat number 12. When I got there, I could hear music. I just couldn't tell which flat it was coming from. Keith's or the one next door? I hesitated before knocking. Suppose that he was living like a rock star, making love to a beautiful blonde or something equally fantastic, and I interrupted him. Suppose that he opened the door and didn't remember me. Suppose that he was drunk and obnoxious like the papers said that he always was. And suppose that I walked away without making the most of his invitation. I would never forgive myself. And think how nice he'd been at the ICA. Not drunk, not loud, not rude, not even funny, but nice. I took a deep breath and knocked on the door and waited. Nothing happened. I could still hear the music. It sounded like a radio. I still couldn't tell which flat it was coming from, so I knocked again and waited. And again, nothing happened. I prepared for this eventuality. I pulled the letter from my bag and slipped it into a large envelope alongside a copy of Jamming, the one with the story on the Who. I had to work on sliding the package underneath the door. These were posh flats after all, where everything fitted together properly, with no drafts, no peeling paint, and certainly no outdoor toilets. The letter had my name and my address and my phone number, and it offered the suggestion that perhaps Keith Moon might like to be interviewed for Jamming. I was hopeful, but nothing more than that. I honestly didn't expect to hear back from him. And this is jumping ahead. Just a couple of weeks. I heard the news from Nicky Horn at the start of his show on Capital Radio at 9 p.m. on a Thursday night. Keith Moon had died at home in Curzon Place earlier that day. Whether it was a heart attack or something else, a drug overdose perhaps, was yet to be determined. But the circumstances didn't change the reality. Keith Moon had died. My grandfather had died when I was 4 or 5 years old. For reasons I'd never figured out, my brother and I had not been told about it until after his funeral. Other than that, I'd never known anyone who had died. Death was always something that happened to other people. But this death happened to me. It hit me in the gut, like a bully had punched me there, and I felt myself go weak inside, the stuffing knocked out of me. Barely a month ago, I had introduced myself to one of my favorite people in the world, one of the most famous people in the world, and he had been nice to me. He had been sweet, gentle, and kind. He had written down his home address and invited me to come round and see him. In the process, he had shown that I need not be scared of or awed by rock stars, that they were human like the rest of us. He hadn't responded to the letter I'd slid under his door in Mayfair, and whether he'd ever intended to, indeed whether he'd ever read it, now I would never know. But I felt like I knew him all the same, and I reacted to his death like it was a member of my own family. I bawled my eyes out. Keith was all over the newspapers the next day. He dominated the front pages of the tabloids the same way the Sex Pistols had done after they swore at Bill Grundy. The Daily Mirror ran the headline, Drugs, Death, Drama of Pop Wild Man Moon, and the other papers offered their own speculative accounts of his demise. He had been Moon the Loon, infamous for drinking and drugging his way across the world, leaving a trail of damaged hotels and ravished women behind him. And now they seem to be suggesting he had got his just reward. They had no idea. Thousands of us looked up to Keith Moon, felt kinship with him for the way he had lived his life, free of convention, of expectations. For the example he had set to those of us who derided the 9-to-5 life, who shivered at the prospect of ending up in a suburban semi-detached with 2.4 children and a dog, who decried that businessmen in Britain all wore pinstripe suits, that secondary-age school children were forced to wear uniforms, that the teachers had long stopped caring, that bullies ran rampant, that the streets were full of violence, that the buses never ran on time, that the country shut down at 11 p.m, with the national anthem as a reminder of our pervasive monarchy, and that the sky was perpetually overcast and the air permanently damp, that the older generation clung to an empire that no longer existed and had been built on violent conquest to begin with, that they genuinely believed that the return of national service and beating us with the birch would solve all the problems of us youth, that fascism was gaining ground, that skinheads were increasing in numbers, and that by their very design, with their endless row of terraced streets and parades of small-time shops, our towns and cities promoted anonymity and servitude. Keith Moon, a working-class boy from Wembley, had emerged from all of this and shown that you could rise above it, that you didn't have to sacrifice your dreams for the security of normality, that you could, by your talents and your determination, and yes, your lunacy, take control of your own destiny to live your life in the stratosphere, far above the miserable majority of the human race, like a comet streaking through the night sky. In his case, that flame had burned out already, and I didn't know enough to fully understand why or how. I just knew at this moment in time, while he was being slandered and libelled and pilloried in death, that I would do anything to set the record straight. Thank you.